Whether we're conscious of it or not, adverts have a way of creating memories in our lives. Now, the book, it's not inside, it's on top memorable moments in South African advertising, takes us back to some of the best and worst ads of our time. We're chatting this morning to the author Khanya Mtshali to take us down memory lane. But Khanya, good morning to you, and thanks so much. But before we actually start our chat, I'm admitting I'm old enough to remember where that term came from, or your title. It's not inside, it's on top. Let's take a listen. Let's remind those who might have forgotten.
Cremora. Also, cremora. Ah, where did she put it? She knows I like my cremora. Now she hides it.
Cremora. Tis so rich and creamy.
Cremora.
You'd expect to find it in the fridge.
Tammy, there's no cremora in the fridge.
It's not inside, it's on top.
It's not inside, it's on top.
Cremora, top of the coffee creamers.
Yes, absolutely. How can you not remember that? And when you hear that, Khanya, it actually takes you back to that moment in your childhood. It brings back a feeling. It brings back who you were with, what was happening in your life. Tell us why you decided to write this book, to put all of this into a book. What was your aim?
Well, you're exactly right. I think for me, what I realized before I wrote this book was that I recalled so many television ads so vividly. And I was always fascinated as to why that was the case. And so I kind of informally started thinking about adverts, interrogating what makes an advert memorable, why were these particular adverts that came out post-1994 so memorable. Yeah. And it eventually materialized into this book. And this book, in my opinion, provided an opportunity to kind of look at our very recent history through a social, political, and cultural lens. And it was a lot of fun to kind of remember these adverts, remember the good parts, the bad parts, and to kind of get a sense of how far we've come as a country, how far we need to go, and how some of these ads in some ways shaped us.
So how did they shape us? I mean, I'd like your take and how you've sort of woven them or interwoven them into this book of yours. Just, how have they impacted? What have they done to our lives as individuals and as a nation, as South Africans?
Well, I think it obviously depends on the ad that you're looking at. So, for example, if I were to take some of the Castle Lager adverts that came out in the late 80s, early 90s, those adverts were showing an image of South Africa that hadn't necessarily materialized on the ground. So on the one hand, you could say this was incredibly progressive because they're showing Black people and white people integrating at a time when that wasn't the case. But then on the other hand, you could argue that they were advancing a dishonest and potentially whimsical idea of race relations. So, it's things like that where you look at these adverts and say, well, they may have shaped or helped a certain constituency in our country move forward and be more receptive to the idea of integration. But on the other hand, they may have been letting down another constituency by being very dishonest about how things were on the ground. So those are the things that I'm kind of looking at. I'm looking at perspectives that were prioritized, perspectives that weren't prioritized, people who were prioritized, people who weren't prioritized, to get a sense of, how these adverts may have been progressive in some senses, but then at other times, letting people down.
Yeah, and I suppose if you're like me, when you hear something like that or you watch something like that, it's not just a memory, it's a feeling that it actually brings up for you. It's actually a feeling, not just, that takes me back, I was 10 or 5 years old sitting in my parents' lounge or whatever it is. So, I mean, it also depends on whether whether you're white, whether you're Black, whether you're, where you fall in all of that and where you were, because a lot of us don't want to remember. We say, what's the point of remembering? Those were the days of apartheid. That's what we were looking for. I actually don't want to feel, but what are the things that we can take from this, even if it's something that doesn't bring up a good memory for us? What are the takeaways from whoever you are from your book?
I think what I'm hoping this book leaves with people is a sense of how much our identity has changed as a country. There are parts of the book where I am looking at a part of our history that is downright unpleasant, but I think these adverts provide a lens through which we can actually see how far we've come and how far we haven't come. I think these adverts also help us see the ways in which we were able to laugh at ourselves. at a time when things weren't so pleasant. And I think if there's one thing you can say about South Africans, regardless of their race, gender, ethnicity, is that we do have an ability to laugh at ourselves and to see humor where there might not be humor. So I think, you know, what I would like readers to potentially take away from this book is just how innovative we are as a nation, just how many problems we have and how we navigate those problems. And, you know, hopefully these adverts will shed a light on those things and kind of reveal how we've progressed as a nation.
I mean, who should be reading this book? With social media and you know, just advertising sort of being almost instant these days, we don't have to go through an ad agency all the time. You don't have to go through all of that as you would have in the time of the adverts contained in your book. With social media, the digital era that we're in, who should most, and I know you probably say all South Africans need to see this, and that's right, but who most should actually be paying attention to what's in this?
Goodness. I think anybody who has an interest in our recent history would pay attention to this book or would potentially like this book. I think people who want to see how far we've come, want to see, you know, the developments we've made in terms of our various industries. I don't think this is only relevant to people who grew up with these adverts. I think that was a big challenge for me, was to appeal to readers who may not have, you know, grown up with these adverts, who may not know what It's Not Inside, It's On Top is. You know, I think it's for people who want to see our progression as a nation, who are interested in our very recent history, because I find it fascinating, and I think we can learn a lot from looking at the very recent past.
So I haven't had a chance to read it yet, Khanya, but just give us some idea, because it says here this is the best and the worst of advertising at the time, and sometimes where it went horribly wrong. Just give us a couple of examples of you know, where it went horribly wrong, and what were some of the worst that you've reflected on here.
Oh goodness. That's a tough one.
Yeah.
So, I mean, there's, for example, I will use Savannah.
Yeah.
So Savannah adverts initially with Barry Hilton were fantastic.
Oh, yes.
I love those adverts.
Yes.
But they were incredibly witty and dry, you know, as the
But you could drink it, yes?
Exactly. But I think of late, what I felt is that a lot of Savannah drinkers happen to be Black women, and they're the most enthusiastic demographic of Savannah drinkers. They will champion Savannah all the time, right? And so those adverts haven't necessarily taken account of that. They haven't necessarily marketed to that demographic, which is strange, because they're the most vocal on social media, they're the most social media savvy. So that's something that, I mean, they had a very recent ad, I think it came out last August, where there were absolutely no women, no Black women. And you think to yourself, do women drink alcohol? Because they're not being appealed to, they're not being marketed to, they're not being targeted. So I think that particular advert was not great, because while it was made perfectly fine, it didn't actually take into account that there's a demographic that could actually help it go forward and really sort of capitalize on its popularity.
Okay, all right. So there's a lesson, and I mean that makes me want to pick up this book and see what else, you know, has sort of missed the mark there, and what has hit the spot. Thank you, Khanya Mtshali, and I think that's a free consult for Savannah. You need to pay her for that one. Well, It's Not Inside, It's On Top by Khanya Mtshali. I think it definitely sounds like a very fascinating read as well.